Most people think wartime food production depended on discipline, rationing, and relentless labor. They picture orderly rows of vegetables, carefully weeded fields, and governments urging citizens to work harder to feed themselves. But buried in agricultural records from the Second World War is a quieter, more unsettling truth. Some of the most effective food systems of the era required almost no work at all. They grew themselves. They resisted drought, pests, and neglect, and in many cases, they produced more reliable nutrition than conventional gardens under stress. These systems were not experimental curiosities. They were taught, promoted, and sometimes officially supported as emergency survival agriculture. Then, after the war, they were largely abandoned, quietly omitted from formal agricultural education, and replaced with labor-intensive models that required tools, fuel, fertilizers, and constant human intervention. The idea of a lazy garden emerged from the simple reality that war removes labor faster than it removes hunger. By the early years of World War II, entire populations faced a contradiction that military planners understood, but civilian culture often did not. Industrial war mobilizes people faster than food systems can adapt. Men were conscripted, transport networks were strained, fertilizers were diverted to explosives production, and fuel shortages made mechanized farming unreliable. Even where land remained available, the ability to maintain it collapsed. Traditional agriculture assumes stability, regular labor, predictable inputs, and time. Wartime destroys all three. The so-called lazy garden was not laziness in the moral sense. It was labor minimization under extreme uncertainty. Agricultural researchers and extension officers in multiple countries, particularly Britain, parts of Eastern Europe, and segments of the Soviet Union, studied methods that could produce food with minimal maintenance once established. These methods drew heavily from older peasant traditions, forest edge cultivation, and what would later be recognized as ecological or regenerative agriculture. But during the war they were framed in practical survival terms, systems that could continue feeding people even if no one had time, strength, or resources to manage them actively. The core principle was to design a garden that behaves more like a stable ecosystem than a farm. Most wartime emergency gardening advice emphasized intensive cultivation: dig more, weed more, plant more. The lazy garden approach moved in the opposite direction. Instead of fighting natural processes, it attempted to structure them. Polyculture planting was central. Multiple species were planted together in dense arrangements, each performing a different ecological role. Some shaded soil, reducing evaporation. Others fixed nitrogen. Some suppressed weeds simply by occupying space aggressively. Root depths varied, preventing direct competition for nutrients. Heavy mulching, often with whatever organic material was available, served as both weed suppression and moisture retention. Once the soil was covered, labor dropped dramatically. Moisture stayed in the ground longer. Germination of unwanted plants declined. Soil structure improved without plowing. Perennial crops played an especially important role. Unlike annual vegetables, which demand seasonal replanting and soil disturbance, perennials return on their own. Wartime planners increasingly valued any food source that required only initial establishment. In some documented cases, abandoned or minimally maintained plots continued producing edible biomass for years. The system did not aim for aesthetic order or maximum yield per square meter under ideal conditions. It aimed for dependable yield under neglect. These systems were particularly valuable in places where normal food distribution had broken down. Urban bombardment, occupation, and infrastructure collapse reshaped the geography of food. Supply chains that once fed cities reliably became fragile or non-existent. Transportation fuel was rationed, refrigeration was unreliable. Imported fertilizer and animal feed were often unavailable. Under these conditions, localized, self-sustaining food systems were not merely convenient, they were strategic assets. In besieged or heavily bombed regions, maintaining a conventional garden could be impossible. Regular watering might be dangerous or impractical. Tools could be lost. Soil could be contaminated with debris. Skilled labor might disappear overnight. Lazy gardens offered continuity. Once established, they required little oversight. Even if access became intermittent, production did not immediately collapse. This was particularly relevant for populations composed largely of children, elderly people, and the medically unfit, groups not suited to heavy agricultural labor, but still capable of harvesting from semi-self-maintaining systems. Military planners quietly recognized that low-maintenance food production increased civilian stability. War economies depend on morale and physical endurance. Malnutrition undermines both. Governments understood that feeding populations required more than ration cards. It required decentralized resilience. Some wartime agricultural pamphlets emphasized soil coverage, mixed cropping, and perennial planting specifically as insurance against interruption. That language is revealing. These systems were not framed as efficient under ideal conditions. They were framed as reliable under disruption. Reliability is a military concept. In regions where labor shortages were extreme, authorities sometimes encouraged reduced tillage and minimal disturbance practices, not because they were environmentally progressive, but because they conserved human energy. The less effort required to maintain food production, the more labor could be directed toward war industries. In this sense, lazy gardens functioned as a form of indirect logistical support. After the war ended, the very conditions that made these gardens valuable began to disappear. Peace restored transport networks, industrial fertilizer production, mechanization, and large-scale agricultural planning. Governments shifted from survival to productivity. The goal was no longer resilience under disruption, it was maximum output under stability. Industrial agriculture excelled at that objective. Mechanization rewards uniform fields. Chemical fertilizers support monocultures. Market systems prefer predictable harvests of standardized crops. Labor-saving ecosystems that grow mixed foods irregularly do not integrate easily into centralized distribution systems. Educational institutions reflected these priorities. Agricultural science emphasized yield optimization, mechanization efficiency, and chemical inputs. Techniques associated with wartime necessity were increasingly viewed as primitive or transitional. In many places, the knowledge was not formally suppressed. It simply became irrelevant to the new economic model, and what is not economically rewarded tends not to be taught. There was also a cultural dimension to the disappearance of these methods. Post-war societies wanted visible progress. Orderly fields symbolized recovery and control. Structured agriculture represented technological advancement and national strength. A garden that looked semi-wild, irregular, or minimally managed did not align with that narrative. It resembled scarcity rather than prosperity. Food production became associated with mastery over nature rather than cooperation with it. Labor itself became a marker of seriousness and discipline. A system designed explicitly to function with minimal effort conflicted with cultural values built around productivity and modernization. Over time, aesthetic and ideological preferences reinforced institutional priorities. The knowledge faded not because it failed, but because it no longer fit the story societies wanted to tell about themselves. Ironically, many principles of the wartime lazy garden later reappeared under different names. Late 20th century ecological agriculture, permaculture, regenerative farming and soil conservation movements rediscovered many of the same techniques. Dense planting, permanent soil cover, minimal disturbance, and perennial integration all resurfaced, this time framed in environmental rather than survival language. Yet the historical context of emergency resilience often remained overlooked. The wartime experience demonstrated something specific and measurable. Under conditions of severe disruption, ecosystems designed for self-maintenance outperform systems designed for maximum efficiency. That lesson has direct implications for modern preparedness, especially in a world where supply chains remain vulnerable to geopolitical conflict, energy instability, and climate variability. The deeper lesson is not about gardening. It is about how societies define preparedness. During total war, preparedness meant maintaining function when systems failed. Redundancy, decentralization, and resilience were practical necessities. During peace, preparedness often becomes synonymous with efficiency. Systems are optimized for normal conditions. Redundancy is reduced because it appears wasteful. The disappearance of the lazy garden reflects that shift in priorities. It was a technology of disruption, not of stability. Once stability returned, the incentive to preserve disruption-resistant systems weakened. History shows that this cycle repeats. Crisis generates adaptive knowledge. Stability renders that knowledge unnecessary. Memory fades until the next disruption. Remembering these forgotten survival systems matters because they reveal how people actually endured global conflict. Wars are not sustained only by weapons and strategy. They are sustained by calories, soil, and the quiet continuity of daily survival. The ability of civilians to feed themselves under extreme conditions shaped endurance on the home front, as surely as logistics shaped armies at the front. The Second World War lazy garden was not a romantic experiment. It was a practical response to systemic breakdown. It demonstrates that resilience is often quiet, decentralized, and easily overlooked once normalcy returns. Understanding these systems does more than recover an agricultural technique. It restores a missing dimension of wartime reality, the constant negotiation between human effort and environmental process that determined whether populations could endure prolonged crisis. If we ignore that history, we misunderstand how societies survive disruption in the first place. If you value this kind of in-depth historical analysis that uncovers the overlooked mechanics of survival during global conflict, subscribe to The Survival Record and share this video with others who believe history is most useful when it teaches us how people actually lived, adapted, and endured when systems failed.